What's up guys, Zero Skater here, and we're going to be doing yet another deck review today, this time for Achilles from Battle of Legends Volume 2. And if you guys missed the last one, that was Bloody Mary, and she is one of the most interesting fighters in the set for sure, even out of all the available releases so far, so definitely go check that one out if you haven't seen it already. But today, we're going to be talking all about Achilles. He was probably my most anticipated fighter leading up to the set's release. And before we get into it, I did just want to mention that the Battle of Legends Volume 2 Release Rumble event will be taking place on December 4th and 5th. If you guys haven't heard the big news, check that out over at the Unmatched Tournament YouTube channel, and I will put a link in the description below, but that's going to be a blast, and I hope to see you guys all there. And as always, be sure to attack the like button if you enjoy this video, and subscribe for more Unmatched content. And with that said, let's get on over and check out Achilles. Alright, so to kick things off here, we see the awesome card back art. And this one doesn't really look like a standard Unmatched card back, which is part of the reason I love it. It's probably one of my favorites and really just looks like an old Greek painting. And it's perfectly fitting for a character like Achilles, so really cool to see here. And great color scheming as well. So looking at the hero card here, we see Achilles is a move 2 fighter, melee with 18 health. His sidekick Patroclus is a melee fighter as well with 6 health. That's a combined health pool of 24, which is very good. The highest we've seen so far in the game, I believe, is Beowulf and Wiglaf, which makes 26 total, and so 24 is very respectable. And the ability reads, when Patroclus is defeated, discard 2 random cards. Now, that seems horrible at first glance, right? But reading on, you see while he is defeated, add +2 to the value of all Achilles attacks, and if Achilles wins combat, draw a card. So this is incredibly powerful. You're basically Big Alice at all times after Patroclus is defeated, and you get a bunch of free draws. So you're going to just be beating down your opponent with massive attacks and keeping up hand advantage that you can use as more attacks, or even to discard to boost to just keep the pressure on your opponent constantly every single turn attacking them. And it's crazy strong, right? But the downside to this is that as the game goes on, the threat of fatigue looms closer and closer because you're going to be drawing so many cards. You're going to be drawing at least 2 a turn, right? Because if you double maneuver, that's 2 cards drawn. If you maneuver and you attack, that's likely 2 cards drawn because when you attack, you're likely winning the combat. And so if you have, let's say, 14 cards left in deck when this ability kicks in, you essentially have 7 turns before you hit fatigue. And that's not that many. And so really what that means is you get 7 attacks, and you got to make those attacks count, deal the damage while you can before fatigue starts hurting you. Now, if the opponent chooses to counterattack you, because you draw anytime you win a combat on offense or defense, if they poke you with something like a regroup, right, then you're either left taking it undefended to avoid yourself drawing, but if you do so, you might run into something bigger like a momentous shift and get punished big time, or you're going to defend, and then you're going to end up drawing a card on their turn as well. So that speeds up the clock even more with that exhaustion threat. And so it really just depends on when this ability kicks in as to how good it is. There's so many variables when evaluating this special ability because there's the timing, there's the matchup, there's the 2 random discards. Don't forget about that, which could completely wreck your hand, based on the current game state when it occurs. And so there's just so many variables to take into account when evaluating this, so it's hard to say how good it is. I think it is incredibly powerful in a vacuum, but with that said, it's really just going to depend on each particular game, and that makes Achilles sort of a volatile fighter in that regard. So let's jump right on into the deck, and the first card we're going to see, of course, is the Achilles Heel, which is what Achilles is known for, and I love this card in this deck. It's so thematic. So if you look at it, it's a 4-value defense card that reads after combat. If you lost the combat, your opponent gains an action. So that's a really swingy card, right? If the opponent moves up and attacks you, and let's say this is your only defense card in hand, if they hit you with a momentous shift, which is a 5 over the 4, you're going to take the damage, they're going to get another action, and they could attack you again undefended. So that's a major punish for you. But of course, if this card blocks that attack in full because it wasn't a shift, it was something weaker, then you're fine, right? And so that's part of the fun of this card, is playing around this both as Achilles and as the opponent on when Achilles should use this and when the opponent should be looking to punish this card if it ends up being played. Obviously, if Achilles has a low hand count, you might want to go for a big attack that would hit over the heel, just in the off chance that they do play it and you get to punish them for it. And as Achilles, on the flip side, if you have only this in your hand as defense, you probably want to back off and gain some more defense cards. But this card just plays into the volatility that I mentioned with Achilles. It's really hit or miss on, how good this card is going to be. But in general, a 4-value defense is very strong, and it will win combat against most attacks. So you're going to have to know the matchup and figure out when is going to be the best time to play this and what options your opponent has to play around this card. So it's super thematic, super fun, and I love seeing this card in the deck. And next up, we're going to see the first of the Patroclus cards, which are very crucial to the deck. If you read this, Battle Frenzy, it says after combat, deal 2 damage to both fighters in the combat. And that effect is guaranteed to happen regardless of adjacency, as long as the effect, of course, isn't cancelled. And it's a 3-value attack, so if you hit over a feint with this and the effect is cancelled, at least you dealt the 1 damage over the feint. But there's 2 copies of this in the deck, so that could be potentially 4 damage to Patroclus himself by using these cards out of his 6 health. So, of course, it's great to see these effects that self-damage him so that you can kill him off even if the opponent is avoiding him. Because, of course, when you use Patroclus as a body blocker to block the opponent from getting to Achilles, they're not going to want to just hit through Patroclus to get to Achilles, because then they're basically doing your job for you. They're killing him off, and they're going to make you an absolute monster with that +2 attack and that endless draw power. So they're going to avoid attacking Patroclus and damaging him at all costs most of the time. So that's where these cards come in. And this card is incredibly strong. I mean, just getting that 4 auto damage on the opponent, somebody like Bigfoot, who has such a beefy health total, or Medusa, if you can pull these off, 4 damage out of their 16 health is very good, regardless of how big of a defense they play, as long as it's not canceled. So you want to avoid getting the Patroclus cards feinted, which is kind of difficult because, of course, if Achilles attacks, they're less likely to feint, which can actually be pretty good for you. So keep that in mind and take advantage of it. They're more likely to feint Patroclus attacks because they're going to want to stop that self-damage that he can do. And Battle Frenzy is just an incredibly powerful card, one of the best cards in the deck, and something you definitely want to utilize before Patroclus dies off. So that was Battle Frenzy, and now we see Battle Hardened. And this is a versatile any. It says after combat, choose a card in your discard pile and return it to your hand. Now, that's an insanely strong effect. It's something similar to Knowledge of the Craft that we've seen from Willow. But that only triggers if you win the combat, whereas Battle Hardened will trigger no matter what. And there's 2 copies of Battle Hardened in the deck. So if you have a Battle Hardened in the discard pile, you can use that second copy of Battle Hardened to recycle that first copy, and you can basically infinitely loop them as long as they're not canceled. So that's incredibly strong to have an infinitely recurring 2-value defense, which is better than taking something undefended, but also to just use it continuously as a bait attack and just eat up your opponent's defense cards with this and just keep cycling it back. And of course you can choose any card in the discard pile, not just the Battle Hardened. So if you want to get back, one of your Patroclus cards that you had previously used, like that Battle Frenzy we saw, that can be incredibly powerful. Or any of the other good cards in the deck that we will see. Battle Hardened is just insanely powerful, not as combat, basically, it's only a 2, but of course from the effect, it's very strong, and the opponent can't feint everything, right? We saw 2 copies of the Battle Frenzy. We'll see even more things that want to be feinted, and we have 2 copies of the Battle Hardened. So some of this stuff, the effects are going to be going through, and they're very powerful, and Battle Hardened being able to recycle anything that fits the current situation is very, very good. This next card, Blessed by Hermes, is kind of one of the weaker cards in the deck overall. It's just a 3-value versatile. It says after combat, move each of your fighters up to 3 spaces. They may move through opposing fighters. So this is a good movement effect for sure, because you can move both Achilles and Patroclus and they can go through people, so you can really set up your positioning however you'd like when you use this card. It's just, there are better cards in the deck, but this is good for, it's a good utility card in certain situations. If you get pinned, you might want to move through to get out of the pin. If your opponent attacks Achilles, you might want to move him away on defense and then bring Patroclus up so that he's already adjacent starting on your coming turn. Patroclus can make a double attack when he otherwise couldn't have. So obviously this has its uses. It's pretty good overall. It's just one of the less exciting cards in the deck, but in general, you'll find this card to be pretty useful throughout the game. And next we're going to see one of the strongest cards in Achilles' deck. It is Brothers in Arms, and it's a 4-value attack that says after combat, if Patroclus is not defeated, gain an action. So this card seems really simple at first glance, and it's actually quite complex because it has 2 different uses based on whether or not Patroclus has died. So if he has not, you can use it as like a combo card like Bruce does, and set up a big attack turn where you get multiple attacks and maybe run your opponent out of defenses and land damage that way. Otherwise, if Patroclus is defeated, you won't gain the action, unfortunately, but this 4 bumps up to a 6 because of Achilles' +2 attack from his ability. So it becomes basically like a log from Bigfoot, and there's 3 copies of this in the deck, so we all know how good 3 logs in the deck can be from past experience. But yeah, I just love how this card can be played differently based on the matchup and the situation, and even individual player preference. Because some people might want to use this as a combo card, and some people might want to hold it until after Patroclus dies. Of course, the danger there is that if Patroclus dies, you get those 2 random discards, and you might lose out on this card from holding it. So you run the risk there, but I love how versatile this card can be, even though it seems very straightforward at first glance. And next up is everyone's favorite card, we have Feint. And there are 3 copies of this card in the deck, so it's your standard set. And of course it reads immediately cancel all effects on your opponent's card. Now, the only real unique thing that this card can do in this deck in particular is that it becomes a 4-value attack once Patroclus has died off. So, if you're attacking and you're trying to hit something like a Looking Glass with the Feint, you can actually still deal 2 damage over the Looking Glass and cancel the effects, and you will draw from your ability. And if you attack into something like a Bewilderment while Achilles is big, I say big Achilles like Big Alice, but that's kind of how I refer to it. But anyways, the 4-value Feint over Bewilderment, that's a huge punish. So this card does have its unique circumstances when Patroclus has died off. Also, if you use it on defense after Pat has died, you're not likely to win the combat because it's only at 2. So that can actually be beneficial for you to block at least 2 damage, but still lose the combat so that you don't draw, because drawing in fatigue is 2 damage, whereas you might have only lost the combat by 1 and only take 1 damage. So like, it's a good trade in that regard. And it's Feint, we know it, we love it. There you go, 3 copies, happy to see it. And next up, we're going to see another common card being Skirmish, and there's 3 copies of this in the deck, and Skirmish is actually very, very powerful. It's one of my favorite common cards for sure, and just because it has so much utility. And so, of course, it reads after combat, if you won the combat, choose one of the fighters, move them up to 2 spaces. So, let's say if you use this on defense, and your opponent is trying to do a double attack turn, you win the combat on defense, you move away, they can no longer attack you for that second attack. Or if you use this on offense, let's say against Sun Wukong, you start your turn next to a clone. You kill the clone, they take it undefended from the skirmish, you use that effect to move up adjacent to Wukong himself, and you hit him with a big attack that they otherwise weren't expecting to take that turn. So just all the little tricks that you can do with Skirmish, I love, and it really varies based on the matchup and the game state, but it's very flexible and there's all kinds of things you can do with it. And a 4-value defense, again, by default is very strong. And if you use this as an attack when Achilles is enraged from Patroclus dying, you're going to have a 6-value attack, and that is essentially 3 more logs in your deck. And so that's just insanely powerful. So Skirmish is just perfect in this deck. It's very, very good. And then we're going to see our first scheme card of the deck being Spear Throw. Now, it reads deal 2 damage to an opposing fighter in Achilles' zone. So this may sound familiar from Momentary Glance from Medusa's deck. And it is literally the same card, just different boost values, because Medusa's is a 4, here we see it only a 1. But again, 2 copies in the deck, just like Momentary Glance, and Spear Throw is very strong. It is the only pass in Achilles' deck, When I say pass, I mean a scheme that does not involve drawing cards, so that you can use that as an action and not deplete a card out of your deck count when you're worried about fatigue, or worried about going over the hand limit and having to discard down at the end of your turn. So Spear Throw is really useful for that, but not only is it useful as a pass, but it's auto damage, and it's really good to recycle with Battle Hardened because you can get more passes and more auto damage, which really helps you out in that fatigue state, because as we know with Achilles' ability, fatigue is a real issue when it gets to the later game, and these Spear Throws can really help you out. So super good card in the deck, and definitely something you want to use before you risk it getting knocked out of your hand when Patroclus dies off. So I would recommend trying to use this sooner than later. And now we finally get to see the bonus attack from Achilles' deck called Test for Weakness. And it is a 1 value attack that reads after combat, Relentless Assault. So as long as this card is not cancelled, you will then trigger a new combat between the same fighters, with Relentless Assault being a baseline of 3. So there's 3 copies of this in the deck, so that's potentially 6 defense cards that your opponent has to waste on just these alone. Not to mention that if Patroclus has died off, these bump up each. So it becomes, instead of a 1 and then a 3, it's going to be a 3 and then a 5. And that's massive damage output. Also keep in mind that both of these attacks are individual, so if you win both combats while Patroclus is defeated, you will draw 2 cards instead of 1. Now that can actually backfire in certain circumstances if you're running into fatigue and taking more damage potentially than you're dishing out with this. But in general, this card's crazy strong. It's definitely something the opponent wants to feint. But remember, because they're more likely to feint the Patroclus cards if Achilles attacks with this, then it's likely to go through uncancelled. So a lot of mind games you can do with this, but Test for Weakness is one of the best cards in the deck for sure. And then we finally get to see the other Patroclus card called the Day of Your Doom. Reads, during combat, you may deal 2 damage to Patroclus. If you do, the value of this attack is 5 instead. So that's a really strong card. It's again very similar to a Momentous Shift, with a different trigger being dealing 2 damage to Pat instead of starting in a different space. But that's almost a benefit to you as well, because you want those cards to self-damage Patroclus so that he can die off even if your opponent is trying to avoid him. And a 5 value attack is very strong, as we know. It can hit and deal damage over things like Skirmish. This is interesting too because it's also optional. If for whatever reason you don't want to deal the 2 damage to Pat, let's say Pat only has 2 health and dealing the 2 damage would kill him off, and you still have yet to use Battle Frenzies and you want to get those used before he dies off, you could choose not to bump this to a 5, whereas Battle Frenzy always triggers the 2 auto damage regardless, unless it's canceled. So it is interesting that this one is optional, and that can actually come into play in certain circumstances, so make sure you keep that in mind. Otherwise, this card is great to have. There's 2 copies, so between 2 of this, 2 Battle Frenzy, you're looking at 8 auto damage that Patroclus can do to himself with these cards out of 6 health that he has. So even if 1 is canceled, you still have 3 others that can do the job. So this is a really strong card and great to have in the deck. And guys, here is a very important card, probably the most important card in Achilles' whole deck, called Under Achilles' Helm. And it's a 2 value defense that reads, immediately, if Patroclus is not defeated, Achilles may swap spaces with him, and if he does, Patroclus is now the defender. So that's a crazy effect, something unlike we've ever seen in Unmatched so far. Now, if Patroclus has died off, this becomes a blank 2 value defense, which is very bad, but it has a 4 boost value, which can be really useful in catching up to the opponent to make those attacks instead of having to waste a turn double maneuvering. So the boost value definitely comes in handy, but just the threat of this card existing means your opponent never wants to go for big attacks on Achilles while Patroclus is alive. And now they don't want to attack Patroclus himself outright, so they're going to have a hard time getting around Pat to reach Achilles, and even once they do, they will be hesitant to throw out big attacks because of the threat of this card swapping in Pat to take the damage instead of Achilles. So it's just a super good card, very tricky. The mind games are huge because if they're wanting to hit big over an Achilles heel to gain the action, and it ends up being the Helm, then they got punished big time because Pat will take that damage. Now, if they want to hit small because they don't want to deal much or any damage to Pat from the Helm, then you defended with Achilles Heel, and they don't gain the action because they hit small. So there's a big mind game between these two defense cards. Both are very powerful in their own right, and it's going to be really tricky for the opponent to play around. And again, the volatility of Achilles is going to come into play with that mind game, because it really just depends what attacks match up with what defenses. You definitely want to use these while Pat is alive, because again, they become blank cards when he dies off. So really, as the opponent, you probably want to save your biggest attacks for after Patroclus dies, because then this blank 2 is not very good, and if it's a big attack hitting over the heel, then you gain an action, which is good for you as well. So it's best to hold your big attacks, if possible, until after Pat dies as the opponent. With that said, as Achilles, you probably want to use the Helm while you have the chance, just to avoid even small amounts of damage and just damage Pat a little bit, because his own self-damaging cards will probably finish himself off the rest of the way if you're trying to kill him and get your ability going. So you probably don't want to hold the Helm too long, because again, it just gets really bad after Pat's died off. So you're just going to have to read the game state, read the matchup, and figure out the best time to use this. But in general, this card is just crazy powerful. And finally, we get to the last card in the deck, which is going to be Wily Fighting. And that reads, after combat, deal 1 damage to each opposing fighter adjacent to your fighter. There's 2 copies in the deck, which is pretty good. It really helps out against decks with those 1 health sidekicks that can really give Achilles trouble. Especially after Pat dies off, you're going to have to get through them eventually if you want to reach the hero and close out the game. So Wily Fighting definitely helps out with that, and it can be recycled with Battle Hardened if you really feel the need in certain matchups, like maybe against Wukong with a bunch of clones or Robin Hood or something. So just the versatility with Wily Fighting is really good, and that extra little bit of auto damage is definitely good as well, and this becomes a 5 value attack after Patroclus has died off, so it's another pretty big attack in general. So this card, it's not the best card in the deck, but definitely good that it exists, and the opponent is going to have to play around it if they're a deck with 1 health sidekicks. And that's going to wrap it up for Achilles. So he is really an interesting fighter, very volatile, like I said. I think every game is going to play out quite different based on the timing of Pat's death. And also in certain matchups, as Achilles, you want to keep Pat alive because you want to pull off his cards. You want to have that under Achilles Helm defense available to you to fully negate an opponent's attack, like against Dracula, let's say, going for those big beast form lethals, or even Beowulf going for those big attacks with heirloom and whatnot. Some fighters, they rely on those couple big attacks to close out the game, and as long as you have the threat of under Achilles Helm, then they have to be weary of when they're throwing those attacks out. Whereas if Pat has died off, then they're free to just throw them out whenever they please. So definitely there are situations where you want to keep Pat alive, and it's just really interesting to figure out the matchups. It's a fun puzzle, but not only that, there's the 2 random discards that occur when Pat does die off, and depending on what that hits, that can totally throw off your game plan. And let's say if it happens when you have a low hand count and you get caught without defenses and the opponent can really just deal a bunch of damage to you quick and then run away the rest of the game, it's really just a lot of variables, which makes him so volatile, but which also makes him so fun. And he's very thematic and very, very powerful potentially when things go his way. So we're going to have to see where he falls in terms of a tier list, coming up after we get some more data on Battle of Legends Volume 2. But again, yet another super thematic and very fun fighter, so look forward to him and the rest of the gang in Battle of Legends Volume 2 coming up soon. And if you guys are interested, make sure you go check out the Battle of Legends Volume 2 release Rumble video and get hyped for that, and we hope to see you guys entering. I know it's a bit of a restricted schedule, so it might be a little more difficult, for people to participate and commit to a certain weekend, but we're hoping things work out well. And we're just going to see how it goes. And also, if you'd like to check out my Twitch channel, go to twitch.tv/ZeroSkater12. And I have been streaming a lot of Battle of Legends Volume 2 practice games as well to showcase the new fighters and, try them out and learn what works and what doesn't. So it's a ton of fun. I'd love to see you guys there on the Twitch stream and hang out in the chat. And of course, if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Unmatched content, and I hope you guys enjoy it. And with that said, I will see you guys in the next one. So thanks again for watching. I'm ZeroSkater12, and I'll see you next time.